What's happening, y'all? Cowboy here, and it is finally time to dive deep into Anthem and take a look at some build videos. So as per the community poll, we're going to be starting things off with Storm. All these build videos are actually going to showcase two builds, and the main goal of these is to give you guys an idea of how you can kit out your Javelin once you reach level 30 and start working your way into the Grandmaster difficulties. So all the footage you're seeing is based on Grandmaster 1, and these builds should serve as a base to help you build up your Javelins. So without further ado, let's jump on in to the first one. Now the first thing we're going to be taking a look at is an ice-based storm build, and one of the main benefits of ice is you bring unparalleled crowd control to the table in the form of freezing pretty much everything on the screen. On top of that, it's important to note that ice deals an additional 25% bonus damage to shields, so you can very easily handle those annoying snipers that are constantly one-shotting people. So to jump straight into it, the first thing I want to talk about are some weapons that are powerful with this build. Now you can really run with whatever weapons you want. There isn't any one particular weapon you absolutely have to have before you can run an ice-based storm, but the Divine Vengeance assault rifle in particular is an excellent choice. And the reason for this is with the every third weak point causing a large fire explosion and enemies being frozen in place, it's very easy to consistently hit these explosions, causing massive AoE on the battlefield. In addition to that, an important thing to note is that while you can't freeze an enemy and inflict burning, the fire explosions caused by the Vengeance aren't impacted by that. They're just considered raw damage, well, fire damage I should say, but because they don't inflict burning, they're not going to conflict with the freezing status that you're going to be applying to enemies. As for our second weapon, we're going to be running with an Unending Battle. Now this is a relatively odd choice for Storm, and the reason for that is it is a close-range melee style weapon. As you can see from Gladiator's Wrath, hitting an enemy at point blank range increases the weapon damage by 110% for 5 seconds, but when everything's frozen solid, it doesn't really matter, making this a very attractive option to quickly dump buttloads of damage into an enemy. Now moving on into the more important stuff, the first thing I want to talk about is our Blast Seal, and that is going to be Ice Storm. Ice Storm is the ideal primer for an ice-oriented storm build. This is going to cause a large AoE, which will freeze up any enemies caught in it, very quickly locking down enemies, especially when you see rifts pop up and enemies are pouring out of it. You can pretty much freeze everything as it's spawning in. Moving on from there, for our detonator, we're going to be running Glacial Spear. Now, Glacial Spear is the only ice-based detonator we have. An important thing to note about Storm's chain combos is that they will spread the elemental effect that you have inflicted enemies with. So if we end up freezing 3 out of 4 enemies in an area and we detonate it with Glacial Spear, that frost effect will spread to that 4th enemy, and as I mentioned, allowing you to basically just perpetually keep the battlefield frozen, and in turn make things a lot easier in team-based gameplay. Moving on to our components, pretty straightforward in terms of Storm. You have one open slot here, which I'm running Integrity Augment just to make me a little bit tankier, but aside from that, we're going to have 4 different elemental-oriented augments here. We're going to have Elemental Conduit, which is going to increase our damage. We're going to have Elemental Synergy, which increases the gear damage. I have the Masterwork version of this, Gunslinger's Mark, but the basic one you're going to want here is one that increases your gear recharge rate. And the reason you want both of these is the one is going to increase damage while lowering the recharge. The other is going to increase recharge while lowering the damage. So by having both, they effectively cancel out to an extent, and you end up with just a 30% increase to gear damage and a 30% increase to recharge. Of course, because this is an ice-oriented build, Ice Inscription is an excellent pickup here, ensuring that everything is staying nice and frozen. And then Storm Combo Augment, just making those chains go that much further, is a solid choice as well. One important thing to note as well is, of course, with the increase in armor and shield you get on Masterwork, as you can see, pretty significant increase. So even if you have a Masterwork and it's not one of these styles of components, it may still be worth using just because it's going to increase your survivability that much more. As for the support seal, I feel you can really run whatever you want for Storm, so I'm going to be running Wind Wall just because it's a nice tool to lock enemies down while trying to res a teammate. So as I mentioned in the build overview, the main gist of this build is CC. You can see right here, dropping a single Ice Storm out froze that entire crowd of enemies. Subsequently, we were able to follow up, keep this guy nice and frozen down, and then from there, if you have Divine Vengeance, of course, you can just absolutely pour massive explosions, continually increasing the damage. And that's really where this build shines, is being able to lock enemies down, especially because of how team-oriented Anthem is. Being able to keep enemies unable to fight back is a huge boon, and it's even more important in the later difficulties where things get that much tankier and are that much more deadly as well. It's also good to kind of showcase how this chain effect works. So you notice right here, when I detonate that combo on the group of enemies, you can see those two enemies that are kind of off to the side that ended up getting frozen. As I mentioned with Storm's combos, anytime you detonate them, you're going to spread that ice effect around the battlefield. And especially because of how much you're executing chain combos, this build also very quickly builds up the ultimate. Which, on that note, it's important to remember that while your ultimate will absolutely decimate groups of enemies, you can also save it as a oh shit button. Anytime you pop your ultimate, of course, you get back full shields and health, so keep that in mind. Another thing to point out here you'll notice is, as I mentioned, you can do bonus damage to shields with ice, so even if you're not using it as a detonator, hitting a shielded enemy with Glacial Spear will usually just instantly blow away most of their shield. As you saw right there, that elite Scar Hunter, pretty much I think it lost about 75% of its shield from that Glacial Spear, and then of course we can follow that up with an Ice Storm, freezing it, and then taking it down however we want from there. Now maybe you're not a fan of ice and you'd rather heat things up, and that is where a fire-oriented storm comes into play. What this build lacks in raw CC, it more than makes up for in its ability to decimate the battlefield and deal buttloads of damage. Now one of the most important things to a fire-based storm is going to be getting a Rauner's Blaze. You can certainly play fire-based storm without it, but getting a Rauner's Blaze is going to make a huge difference because you'll be able to consistently ignite enemies even when your other abilities are on cooldown. This rifle comes in either a Masterwork or Legendary variant, and after only hitting the enemy with 5 bullets, you'll ignite them, making it an absolutely phenomenal weapon to get off those ignites so that you can proc your combos. As for our other weapon, we're going to want something that is effective at taking down shields. To this extent, I'm going to be using the Unending Battle once again. Alternatively, you could go with something like a light machine gun, or even the Divine Vengeance because of the potency of the explosions, but the main thing here is this build's biggest weakness is going to be shields, and so you're going to want something that can put out a lot of damage very fast. Moving on to our focus seal, of course we're going to be using Burning Orb. This is the primary detonating fire nuke of Storm. If you can get the Masterwork version, the Orb of 1,000 Suns, it just gets that much spicier. Awesome thing to pick up. And what's great about this too is you can rapidly tap the right bumper to just throw this out and do a lot of damage, or alternatively you can hold it down and charge it up to detonate combos. Moving on into our blast seal, Living Flame is going to be the primary choice here. What's great about Living Flame is when you throw this out, it's like a little fire dragon that will streak around the battlefield, and anything that isn't affected by a shield will then get ignited, and then you can of course follow that up with a combo. Moving on into our components, very similar to before. We still have Elemental Attunement, Conduit, Synergy, and then of course we have the Gunslinger's Mark here, but this is usually the Elemental recharge. Of course, swap out Ice for Fire Inscription, and then a combo augment again is nice to pick up. Similar to before, if you have Masterwork pieces here, put them in if you can match things up. You know, just the raw increase in Masterwork, looking at the armor and shield reinforcement here compared to a normal one, you can see it's a massive difference, and it's really going to make an impact in your survivability overall as Storm. Once again, support Seal Heal is really going to be purely up to choice. One thing I do want to point out with the weapons is if you can get something that has bonus fire damage, such as how I have on the Unending Battle Healer, that will certainly help your damage output overall. Another thing to make mention of is looking at our blast seals, there's also Flame Burst, and while Flame Burst is a lot of fire damage, it doesn't ignite the targets, it's just raw damage output. So alternatively, you could run that, especially if you have a Rauner's Blaze, which will focus on igniting the enemies, but ultimately I still found that Living Flame was just incredibly effective at lighting large groups, allowing me to execute just that much more in terms of chain combos. Battlefield-wise, a fire-oriented storm is pretty simple to play. The main gist is you get up into the air, drop out your Living Flame, and then start bombing everything with Burning Orb as it gets ignited by the flame. So as you can see, very much a glass cannon in this sense. You know, you don't have the CC available from the ice, but you are able to just consistently get enemies on fire and then do huge detonations with your Burning Orb, and it ends up being a buttload of damage that you're putting out. And similar to before, because you're so frequently detonating off these chain combos, you're going to be filling up your ultimate bar very quickly as well. On the note of detonating combos, another important thing to remember here is even though your primary thing is going to be igniting enemies and then detonating them with your Burning Orb being a detonator can of course detonate enemies afflicted by any status. Kind of going back to what I said about how ice and fire don't mix, I think it's important to note that that only applies to the frozen and ignite status. You can't have an enemy that is frozen and ignited on fire at the same time, but an enemy that's frozen can be detonated by a Burning Orb, and vice versa, an enemy that is burning could be detonated by a Glacial Spear. But that's going to be it for this one, guys. Some closing thoughts to remember is, as a Storm player, make sure you're almost always in the air. Storm can hover significantly longer than all the other Javelins and has a much lower heat buildup in terms of how much heat is being generated while he's hovering. While your flight is roughly the same, you know, you can hover pretty much the entirety of a battle, and that's really going to allow you to kind of have this Sky Wizard type feel, where you're just constantly throwing out nukes from above. But either way, thanks for coming by. Hope you guys enjoyed checking out the first of the build videos. I already have all the gear I need for the Colossus build videos, so I'll have 2 different Colossus variants coming your way, probably in a day or so. And then moving on from there, of course, we will have the Ranger builds and then the Interceptor builds as well. One last point, of course, these builds are oriented towards getting you into Grandmaster difficulty. They are by no means the best builds in the game, but as I spend more time in Anthem and collect more legendaries and masterworks, I will be doing updated build guides that are more focused around what specific masterworks you should work toward to be as powerful as possible. But in the meantime, these builds should definitely give you guys a baseline to really break on into the Grandmaster difficulty, which at the very least will get you able to farm those masterwork and legendary pieces. So as always, thanks for coming by. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will catch you next time with some more spicy Anthem action.